Socialization seems to be the issue that so many people want to bring in competition and contrast to homeschoolers. It's almost as if the world thinks that social issues are uniquely placed in the realm of homeschooling. And I don't even know where this issue comes from because if we're honest and we look around at kids today, there's plenty of issues. There's plenty of awkwardness. There's antisocial behavior. There's violence. There's drugs. There's bullying. There's inappropriate sexual expressions. And yet, the vast majority of children, which necessarily means the vast majority of those children who are acting out in those ways, are not homeschoolers. So, why is it that this issue gets pegged as the primary concern that people who are either skeptical of homeschooling or outright against homeschooling bring kind of as the trump card that your child's not going to be socialized? Well, let's dig into it. My name is Dr. Blake Willard, and I am the founder of the Homeschool Mastery Group. I've been in Christian education for over 13 years, served in a number of different fields across kind of the educational spectrum, but ultimately love homeschooling. And so that's why we're talking about homeschooling here today. Socialization, for whatever reason, again, is the issue that people have to bring. And what's funny is once you're on the inside as a homeschooler, socialization, except for hearing critiques from other people, is basically never an issue. This just proves to be the lived reality of most people today. And I think probably part of it is because they have to hear it a lot, right? If you have an issue that's constantly being brought to your attention, what necessarily is going to happen is you're going to form a better defense, probably, than the average person for what you have to say about that issue, right? You're going to be able and willing to give an answer. There's this idea in the New Testament that Paul kind of describes that we should be willing to give a defense for our faith at any time. And why would you have to do that? Because people are going to attack your faith. Well, it's the same thing for homeschoolers. People are going to attack you on the issues that they disagree about. And you should be willing and able at any time to be able to give a defense, right? I mean, your children arguably are probably the most important and valuable resource that you have. And so, if that is the case, then you should be able to give a defense for your own peace of mind of why you do the things that you do. So, let's dig into the homeschooling issue. Let's approach it with confidence, not with an adversarial mindset, but an ability and a willingness to articulate that our children are best suited for every challenge that life puts before them. I think that's what parents want. When someone decides to homeschool proactively, it's because they want to provide their child the best opportunity in every way possible to thrive in life, to get ahead, to have opportunities that they didn't have. And so socialization is just another one of those issues. So again, let's talk about it. One one thing that would be good for us to first, I don't know, expand, extrapolate is what makes for good socialization. Because people use that as an argument, and I don't even think they have a clearly defined picture in their mind of what it is exactly that they're talking about. I think when people ask the question, and the most common question is, well, what about their socialization, right? So let's say a parent or a friend or an acquaintance hears that you're homeschooling, and they say, well, what about their socialization? What they're really saying is, aren't kids socialized when they're grouped together, like in school? And so, because your child is mostly not grouped together with other kids their age for long periods of time, like in school, they must not be socialized. Okay, let's start to break it down. Okay, we said what's good socialization? Good socialization fundamentally must mean good social skills, the ability to interact in society in a way that leads to your thriving and success rather than your isolation and your ostracization, right? So, if that's the case, do homeschoolers have the ability to be socialized well? Yes. Yes, they do. And if that wasn't obvious, by the title of this video, let's try to extrapolate again. What do we mean by good socialization? Okay, if your child is going around and they do not know how to communicate with others, that would be an indicator of poor socialization, right? With others could include their peers. With others certainly could and should include adults. But more importantly, it's understanding that there is a right approach to communication to each age group. And it's, in a sense, being able to communicate with each person according to their kind or their ability, their area of development. In part, good social skills is responsive because someone who is socially adept is able to pay attention to the nuances and the differences of what's going on with the people around them and be responsive, not for their sake, but for the sake of those that they're communicating with, right? And well, let's talk about public school a little bit, right? That's kind of the vast majority of other kids fall into this category. Of course, there are other options. There's private schools, and this falls into that category too. But public school kids, by and large, are they good socializers? Are they good at socialization? Are they good communicators? And I guess that means it depends. Because if you look at publicly schooled kids today, right, we'll just use our own context, like right where we're sitting right now. Are these the models of how you want your children to interact with others as they grow into life? And for me, and I think for most homeschoolers, the obvious answer is no. I think for people who are even advocates of public education, if they were intellectually honest, they would say the same thing. They don't think that a lot of what is on display is a good fit, right? What we see on the news time and time again, which are antisocial behaviors, are not byproducts of homeschooling. They are epidemic within the public education system, though, right? Bullying, sexuality, drugs, violence, right? Gun violence. None of these things are quality socialization. They're not rightly socialized behaviors. And yet, again, they are everywhere. Look, I was publicly schooled, and within my context, within my context, everyone couldn't speak to everyone in my school. It's actually ironic because yes, there's a whole bunch of kids that are grouped together, but it was extremely antisocial in many ways. It's funny, I looked back many years later, and my specific school, they like there was a news article that was kind of that aired on national television about the cliquiest school in America, and that was my school. Right? What does it mean to be cliquey? It means that every single person was separated and bisected by group, by ethnicity, by kind of like social class, by their preferences, band kids, jock kids. But even like further than that, it was 12th grade band kids, 10th grade band kids, right? 11th grade jock kids, and everyone had their own spot and circle with which they associated, and they did not break out. I didn't have the ability, like I didn't feel like I had the ability as a high school student to just walk across the circle to the people who were in a group right there, who were within a year or two of my age, and talk to them because they were a different group. This is not this is not proper socialization. This is not social adaptation. This is ineptitude, like at its finest. I literally couldn't talk to them. It felt weird, it felt uncomfortable, and there were very few people who had the ability to cross those boundaries. So again, what makes for good socialization? It's not that. It's not the violence, it's not the bullying, it's not the drugs, it's not the obscure sexual expressions that are happening all over the place within public education, right? For me personally, and for just about anyone I've ever met who homeschools, they don't want those children to do, their children to do those things. So they're homeschooling. Again, not just for those reasons, but it's another fruitful benefit. So when people come out and say, what about socialization? Or publicly schooled kids, even, I get comments on YouTube. I can tell these effing homeschool kids a mile away. Yeah, and they can quickly identify you as well. You see, the fact that you can identify whether someone has received a certain form of education doesn't mean that they're lacking the skill. In fact, it might be a reflection of a deficit in the person asking the question. Because are children socialized by being in groups of their peers for 8 hours a day in very controlled environments where they don't have the ability to express themselves, maybe as they desire, but only according to what is acceptable for their peers in that very specific context? Because that's really what happens in a classroom setting, right? What is acceptable for your peer group may not be acceptable in the wider culture, but things kind of devolve sometimes. And this is what happens in schools all the time, right? As a teacher, when I was in a classroom setting, I was constantly trying to protect the culture of our classroom so that it didn't devolve into nonsense that didn't apply everywhere else. It didn't even have to be bad. It could just be silly or foolish, but it would it would prevent these kids from being able to communicate well or accurately in other contexts. And again, this is what I wanted to prevent. So, can our children be socialized well at homeschooling? Well, let's compare again public school versus socials versus, let's compare again public school versus homeschoolers. Okay, we just described a lot of the problems that we see happening in public school, right? These kids are, I mean, furries. What are furries? Why are children walking around dressing like and acting like animals? And it's tolerated. This is both antisocial from the children and the adults, right? There's, again, the widest possible expression of sexual expression and orientation and identification. How is there so much diversity within what is actually a relatively small group? Well, these ideas are being seeded and planted and then acted out. And the kids then graduate, ideally, and enter the world, and it's weird. Right? People don't know what to do with them, especially people of different generations, which is who these publicly schooled kids will need to identify with in the future, not just people within 12 months of their age. That doesn't make any sense because it's not the way that life operates. Let's talk about homeschoolers by contrast. Well, first off, homeschoolers' value orientation is going to be aligned, more than likely, with the people who are raising them and spending the most time with them, and that is their parents. Their parents are spending the vast majority of each day with them, instilling in them their values and modeling for them right behavior. You know, the difference between public school and homeschool is when a child acts out in a way that's inappropriate, or we'll say antisocial, no one may say anything in a public school setting. It might actually even be encouraged. But you know what's going to happen every time, almost every time in a homeschool situation, is that parent will correct them because they see behaviors that are inappropriate, especially when they're out in public, and they tune them up, right? They'll talk to their kids either at that moment if it really needs to be addressed, or in private, because they don't just send them off for 8 hours a day. As soon as they see something that needs to be corrected, they have the entire day, every day, to talk about, to address it, to model it. And so, slowly over time, right behaviors are shaped and modeled. Now, might there be a period in a homeschooler's life where they are weird? Sure. Will they always be that way? I don't think so. I don't think that that experience proves that. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't weird homeschoolers, because there's a weird every kind of schooler, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the constant course correction is what keeps homeschoolers in alignment and moving in the right direction. And it's what's lacking in public school and even in traditional classrooms, because the accountability of a caring adult who knows the child and understands how to shape and direct them towards what is good and beautiful and true and right, that is what is lacking in mass education. And that is what homeschool offers to children who now get a completely honed and unique version of social skill development that other schoolers miss, right? And so, yes, there is a significant contrast in the way that homeschoolers communicate versus the way that publicly schooled kids communicate. And a lot of times it's because publicly schooled kids are the majority. They think that's weird when they see and hear homeschoolers. But what they're actually looking at that's weird is they communicate well with adults. They have developed critical thinking skills and they know how to ask questions. Why are they talking so much? Why are they so confident? Why are they interested in all these subjects, right? Whereas a publicly schooled kid, a lot of times, don't want to talk about anything. They don't look adults in the eyes. They don't know how to hold a conversation. They're extremely isolated, even though they're in large groups. They're addicted to their devices and dopamine and their phones. And so when they see that in contrast to themselves, it looks weird because when they say weird, what they really mean is different. They don't mean this works well over time in society because that's actually what's true for homeschoolers, right? Everyone will continue to be honed and polished so that they learn in the workplace, they learn in church, they learn in relationships how to continue to hone themselves to best align with communicating with their peers, with adults, with different generations, with children. But all of those skills need to be brought together. And it's really only in homeschooling where they get the most opportunities to socialize across generations in multiple contexts in a way where they're actually growing, testing and experimenting and refining their own behaviors. Again, public school, it's more of the same and a lot of it every single day. So, are there weird homeschoolers? Yes, there are weird homeschoolers. There are weird public schoolers. There are weird private schoolers. There are weird every kind of schooler. That is a fact. It has to be a fact. There's no way for there not to be situations where children and their own idiosyncrasies don't come out in ways that to the rest of society look a little colorful or a little off. Again, when we're saying weird, we don't mean violent or dangerous. Like these things by and large are reserved to public school and to traditional classrooms because it's really these antisocial behaviors grouped and supported in mass that lead to these crazy things that we see on the news. Now, we're assuming the homeschool environment that a child is in is one of support and love. We're not talking about the extremes in cases of isolation and abuse because not only are those not acceptable, nobody would broadcast those as a model that anyone wants to propagate or standardize, right? So it just happens. It happens in every form of education. I believe the vast majority of these cases, it happens in the public school setting where there is individualized trauma as well as mass trauma amongst students. It does happen, unfortunately, God forbid, in homeschool situations too. But again, the vast majority of homeschoolers, anyone who actually is doing it because they care and love about their children and they want to see them succeed. And so they're trying to figure it out, even if struggling, how to help them be successful. Are they weird? Okay, well, let's make a quick area and a way that we can define this. Are their parents weird? The vast majority of cases, what children surround themselves with is going to be what you see modeled. It doesn't mean that they'll be that way forever because they won't always be surrounded with the same people. In public school, they're surrounded with all kinds of stuff. And they start to reflect all kinds of stuff. And in my opinion, a lot of times that means it looks a little unusual, antisocial, strange. And sometimes with homeschoolers, the parents are a bit socially awkward. They're not amazing communicators. Maybe they're extremely introverted. And that tendency to lean towards isolation can come out in the way that their children communicate to. So, if the children are not in a household where they're intentional about giving them opportunities to spend time with their peers in extracurriculars, in church events, surrounding themselves with other generations, with family, and they're talking about these things, then it could look a little unrefined. And I think that's honestly what we mean when we say weird. But these kids are a bit unrefined. Does that exist? Yes. Is it harmful to society? Definitely not. Will that child have the ability to grow out of that? In almost every case, the answer is yes. But you will see reflected what you see at home, right? What children are surrounded with is what you will see reflected back with their peers in different social settings. And again, so a parent who is concerned about this only need work on themselves. That's actually the easiest, most simple solution, right? My wife and I is the we, used to be in a church situation when homeschooling was a little bit more fringe in the wider society pre-COVID. It was a big homeschooling community. There were a lot of people doing it in a way that we had never seen done before. And so it got us thinking about homeschooling with a new perspective because we both grew up publicly schooled in California, which is what almost everybody had experienced. And so because of that, we are looking around. And my wife and I both in agreement that our own children one day would be homeschooled because we saw that this was better in so many ways. And we saw it done really well. But she was concerned still with that same question that many of you are asking, and many people who will ask you, will our children be weird? And the answer that I was able to give her from relationships and experiences, let's look at the Green family. What do you know about them? Are they weird? Well, let's look at the Johnson family. Let's look at the Sperry family. And I could point to these different families across our church that we knew with children of all different ages. And we knew which ones were really social and socially adept, and we knew which ones were a little awkward because their parents were socially adept or a little awkward. And the children almost perfectly reflected those same behaviors to the people they were around. And my point was simple, and I think it was proven, which is the parents who are raising their children are going to be the ones who are modeling for their children how they're going to act. If the parent, in our opinion, comes across as a little awkward, the child, more than likely, is going to struggle with a little bit of awkwardness. It's not a problem. It didn't mean those people weren't nice to be around or that we didn't care for them. It just meant maybe they weren't socially adept to the same degree as this other family, who just about everybody loved to be around because they were just good at that, right? But the vast majority of cases, these were wonderful people with wonderful parents raising wonderful children. And that's what we saw on display. And this is proven true in every single context that I have ever met with homeschooling families. Right? I work with hundreds of homeschooling families and have worked with hundreds of homeschooling families. And I can pretty much tell, based off getting to know the parents, about what I would expect to see with the children. Now, don't get me wrong. The thing that will influence your children more now than at any other time in history is the fact that there are so many outside influences from things like social media, like the internet, being online, devices, YouTube, right? These things become, in a lot of ways, the peers of children today, right? Children will spend hours, thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours on devices, watching, streaming, YouTube, social media, flicking, scrolling from sometimes the earliest ages. And I don't care if you're in public school, private school, homeschool, if you start feeding this to your child from the earliest ages, from before they can even talk, they're holding the device to get them to focus or to get them to stop having a tantrum or to entertain them so that you can do something. You're going to see the detrimental effects of that on display. It's not going to look like social adaptation. It's going to look socially awkward. It's going to look weird. It might even look, in a lot of ways, dangerous to that child's development and health because it is replacing the influence of the people who are around your children. Instead of being influenced by parents and watching them, they're now paying attention to something that ultimately is not real. And that false reality creates a false, appropriate kind of acting out and socialization that just doesn't translate to reality. And it's dangerous. So I'm not going to go on the rabbit hole about devices. There's a time and there's a place, in my opinion. But every time is not the time, and every place is not the place. And if you find yourself depending on these things, it will be not only to the harm of your child's socialization, it will be to the harm of their development overall. So we have to be careful, be aware, be concerned, and just pay attention, right? So last, why are homeschoolers better suited for socialization than publicly schooled kids? Well, we've been saying it. You have parents who, by and large, are concerned about their children's development and are working intentionally with every facet to make sure that their children have what they need, right? If you're a homeschooler, you already know the socialization concern. You've heard it from people. And so you're thinking proactively, what can I do about that? Besides the modeling that you do, which actually is the most important part, you are also maybe actively involved in a community of your church. You're getting them involved in a co-op 1, 2, 3 times a week, bi-weekly, monthly. Maybe there's extracurriculars, there's sports, there's music classes. And again, every one of these different activities allows them to be under the influence of someone else, oftentimes with peers of different ages, as well as with adults who communicate with a different approach and different style. And all of those things are honing and sharpening your child's ability not only to be adapting, to adapt to that context, but to know that people communicate in different ways and people respond to my communication in different ways. And so they're just learning to pivot enough that their expression comes out in a way that can be best received by the people around them. Homeschoolers are so intentional about this, about socialization, about peer relationships, about interactions with other adults. When they take their children to the store, they ask them to look someone in the eyes and acknowledge them. And this is something you do not see from kids in public school because there's no accountability with right, socially appropriate actions. And so you'll see parents who charge their children with the responsibility to find something, purchase it, and check out all by themselves, which is a huge social skill and challenge that these children are having the opportunity to navigate. Look them in the eyes, communicate. And what do you say when they are not doing it well? You correct them. You ask them to do it again, right? You model it, and then you have them repeat what's right, and then you send them out to go do it again. And this process is the constant daily honing, little corrections that ultimately make the biggest difference through consistency over time. So again, if you're fearful of socialization or you're concerned that socialization is going to be an issue for homeschoolers, guys, look at the reality. Look at what homeschoolers are competing against. These kids who are completely isolated from their parents, who are their best relationship and model in most contexts, or should be, who are surrounded by kids with a whole bunch of different layers of baggage that they're bringing together and can often go unsupervised, developing these little microcultures where you see things acting out in crazy ways, who are overstimulated with devices, who are getting exposed to crazy ideas online and off, and are allowed to propagate those things in environments where there's violence and danger and sexual outbursts and bullying and all these different things happening all the time. These kids, what we call socialization in public school is the self-preservation of a child protecting themselves from the discrimination that they have to experience and the abuse that they have to experience if they stick their head up and look any different than anyone else. Personally, as a homeschooler, I want my child to look different. I want them to be able to respond to all different, areas of life, and I want them to have unique interests that are not defined by what their peers say is good, because what their peers say is good is a season of life that's not going to last. So I want them to develop their own interests. Again, a special skill of homeschooling, unique to homeschooling, where they can become good at something before they have to go show it to the world, right? So much that could be said about this topic, but I hope what you take away is that socialization is not an issue limited to homeschoolers. Weirdness is not necessarily a byproduct of homeschoolers. It's a byproduct of parenting and the relationships that you surround your children with. And ultimately, if you are concerned about homeschooling, then you're already taking steps that other parents are not to shape your child's education and development in a way that's going to put them ahead of their peers rather than behind.